Everyone. Welcome back to Richmond Public Library Presents Young Writers Workshop. I'm Mr. Lewis from the Ginter Park Library, and today we're going to be discussing characters, the players in your story. We're going to talk a little bit about who they are and how you can fully develop them to make them as interesting as physically possible. So we'll start with a who's who, because there are different types of characters in your story. The first, and arguably the most important, is the protagonist. The protagonist is the main character of your story, the person who the reader will be following. This is their story. Now, of course, you can have more than one protagonist, especially if you have a story that has more than one point of view. So if you have two or three characters where you will switch between who is telling the story, you can have more than one protagonist. Next is the antagonist. And the antagonist is the person or thing that is preventing, intentionally or not, the protagonist from attaining their goal. Remember, the story is all about the protagonist getting what they want, achieving some goal. It could be something very big, something very small, but the point is it's all about them getting what they want. And the antagonist is trying to stop them. Now, it might be that they're actively trying to stop them. They know that the protagonist wants this thing, so they're doing everything they can to make sure that they don't get it. Or it could just be something that's in the way. The antagonist could be the weather, the location, distance. It could be something that's completely intangible. Maybe it's a disability that the character has. Something that is preventing the protagonist from attaining their goal. Next up is supporting characters. They are people who are major parts of the story, and they're usually associated with the protagonist and or the antagonist in some way, but it's not their story. They are there to support the protagonist or antagonist. They are there to play fairly large roles, so they have a spot in the story, but it's not their story. And next is side characters. And these are characters who they're in the story, they have a part to play, but it's usually fairly small and they don't appear very often. So they are exactly what you would think of as a side character, someone who is off to the side, present, but not necessarily incredibly important, especially compared to a protagonist, antagonist, or a supporting character. So in this video, we're going to cover three specific ways that you can help develop your character. When you're making your characters, I recommend that you keep the information written down somewhere, maybe like have a character sheet for your main characters, maybe a list of side characters or supporting characters who don't have as much information about them, but just have like a sentence or something, just so you have an idea of who they are and what they're doing. So the three things we're going to cover are motivations. Now, every character wants something. Every character. Not only protagonists have goals. Everyone does. Next is qualities. Every character has aspects of their personality that are positive or negative. We can think of them as virtues and flaws. These are very important. They help shape the character. And the last thing we're going to talk about are features. These are a character's description. What they look like, how they act, what they're like, their personality, things like that. It's not just the physical features that we're going to be talking about. It goes much broader than that. All right, so first, let's talk a bit more about motivations. The reason your character is doing what they are doing. Everybody wants something. It's the driving force. Sometimes it's simple. We want the next meal. We want to get paid. We want the next technology. We want time to read a book. Whatever it is, we all want something. We all want many things, but we all usually have one large goal. And during your story, your character is going to have one specific goal in mind. They might develop more goals as they go along, and they might accomplish some goals along the way. But there's always one overarching goal that your character wants to achieve. It's their driving purpose. But not only protagonists have motivations, even antagonists or bad guys have their own motivations. Now, it's important to remember that everyone is the hero of their own story. When you are writing your story, it's actually important to keep this in mind. A supporting character in a story doesn't know that they're a supporting character. Does that make sense? The main character of the story doesn't know that they're the main character of the story. They are just living their lives through your story. So a supporting character will have their own goals. An antagonist will have their own goals. Assuming it's a person, of course. Now, we talked about how sometimes antagonists can be characters that are not people, something like the weather. The weather doesn't have a goal, it's just a force of nature. But any character that is an actual person or in any way has a personality will have goals. Even if that goal is just to continue to exist, that's still a goal. Okay? So the question is, how badly do your characters want to achieve their goal? Sometimes characters, and like people, will think that it's not worth the effort. Maybe their goal is just a little bit too far. So how badly do your characters want to achieve their goal? What are they willing to do, to go through, to give up, to get it? Because that's the whole purpose of your story, showing the progression of your main character or characters in achieving their goal. What do they have to do? What do they have to overcome? What do they have to sacrifice? So keep this in mind when you are writing your characters. Keep in mind what they want. What are their motivations? Because that will determine how a character acts. A supporting character might help a protagonist, but if it doesn't align with their own goals, they might not. So when you're writing your characters, make sure you understand why they are doing the things that they are doing. So beyond motivations, every character also has certain qualities. They are what we call traits, and they help shape who the character is and what decisions they will make. Depending on what kind of person a character is, they will react differently to a given situation. One character might react one way, whereas another character will react another way. So you have to ask yourself questions like, is your character lazy? Are they skilled? Are they easily bored? Are they passionate? Are they kind? Are they selfish? What kind of person is your character? If you want, you can think up some scenarios and say, how would my character react in this situation? And that could help dictate to you what kind of a person they are. And this is really important because sometimes the traits can have surprising effects, because you might put a character in a situation that you originally expected to go one way, but after looking at their traits and combining it with their motivations and their personality and everything else, you might realize they would not act the way you originally thought they would, because it doesn't fit their character. Now, in addition to positive traits, characters also have flaws or negative qualities. But this is a good thing because it makes them more interesting, because everyone has flaws, everyone has negative qualities. And it's important to realize that your characters in your story will have negative qualities too, whether they're good guys or bad guys, depending on how you want to refer to them. It's important because you need to make the character relatable. If they're not relatable, then no one's going to be interested in them. And this is a dangerous trap. We call this a Mary Sue, a character who has no negative qualities, who's always perfect, who's always the best at everything they try, who's always able to win, no matter what they're put up against. They're just not fun to read. These are called Mary Sues. It comes from a fan fiction story where a character named Mary Sue basically had all these qualities, where they were always perfect, they did everything exactly the way they were supposed to, and it was incredibly boring. And it just became the term for this kind of character, one who is not interesting because they do not have negative qualities. So as you're fleshing out your characters, as you're rounding them out, think about the different qualities that they have. What makes them interesting? How are they relatable to the reader? That's very important, because if a character is not relatable to the reader, they are not going to care about them. If you're not going to care about them, they're not going to want to read their story. Next, we're going to be talking about a character's features. Now, I'm using features here in a very broad sense, and not just for physical features, as you'll see. But we'll start with those. We'll start with physical features. This is how a character looks. So how do they look on a normal day? What kind of hair do they have? What color is it? How long is it? Is it styled in a certain way? What color eyes do they have? What color is their skin? What kind of clothes do they wear? All the things that they would normally look like on any just average day. It's important to keep that in mind, both for yourself and for your readers. For yourself, so that as you're writing, if you happen to describe something that a character is doing or saying or wearing, you can keep it consistent so that you're not being very inconsistent with your characters, because readers will point that out and it tends to draw attention to itself. But it's also important for the reader so that they have a clear image in their mind of what your characters look like. But next, let's talk about social features. What I mean by this is, how do your characters act? How do they talk? Do they talk differently in public than they do in private? Things like that. So how are their mannerisms? Are they polite? Are they brusque? Are they no nonsense, or do they tend to hem and haw? Do they like casual conversation, or do they always go straight to the point? Do they have an accent? Do they like chit chat, or do they not like to talk at all? These are all social features. And next, I'm going to talk about personal features. What I mean by this is their character's family background, their history, their ethnicity, and their relationships. So this is kind of a catch-all for their background, what kind of life they are living at the time of your story, and more or less where they come from and who they are, as far as things like race, nationality, citizenship, things like that. Because it can vary widely character to character, of course, and it's important to understand how these things can also affect your character, because all of these things, whether it's physical features, social features, or personal features as I'm describing them, they will all affect a character, and it'll affect how they act, it'll affect how they behave in given situations, it'll affect how they talk, and it will affect their motivations, because all these things are what shape your character. So now that we've covered the basic ideas behind characters and how you can help shape characters, let's try to bring it all together here at the end of the video. The goal is really to make your characters relatable. You want them to be interesting. You want them to be characters that the reader wants to know about. And as I said, one of the keys of writing good characters is to make them feel real. Make them feel like someone the reader would not necessarily like, but understand. So use the tips that we've covered to help make your character more relatable. Now, you don't have to include every single piece of information in your actual story. You can just have that be background information for yourself, but just think about how that information affects the way your character acts and talks and makes decisions. But there is one thing to keep in mind, and that is you have to let your characters develop naturally. As your character goes through the story, they will change. This is called the character arc. The character at the start of the story is going to be different than the character at the end of the story. There will be change. Otherwise, there's not much of a story. The character arc is almost as important as the actual plot of the story, because the reader is following your character. They want to know what's going to happen to them. So leave room for development as your story goes on. Think about your character's background, personality, and all of their information. think about how that will affect their actions, and think about how those actions will affect them. Because there is give and take when it comes to character choices. Sometimes a character will make a choice that will eventually change the way they will react in the future. A character might become less shy. They might become angrier. They might become more helpful over time, depending on the actions they choose throughout the story. And an important aspect of this is showing and not telling. This is probably something you've heard quite a lot, either from teachers or in general when it comes to writing. Show, don't tell. How do you do that properly? Well, in a nutshell, it's using words that describe action as opposed to just outright description. I could say, this character was nervous. And that's the end of the sentence. It gets the point across, but it doesn't really do you much good, does it? But if I say things like, they shifted nervously, or they moved from one foot to the other, their eyes darting around the room, they kept fidgeting with their hands, that shows how they're nervous. Not necessarily why they're nervous, but it displays to the reader that they are nervous. Now, I said nervously in that sentence, but you would get the same point across even if I hadn't said that word. Because the actions are the actions of someone who is nervous. So keep that in mind as you're writing your characters. Don't just outright describe the way they're feeling. Show it through their actions. Now, some things, of course, you can't just show because this is a literary medium. That means that we're using words. There's no pictures involved here. So I have to say that the character's hair is black, brown, blue, whatever. I can't show that through actions. I still have to describe it using the words. But overall, try to use actions to describe a character's personality and their emotional state. That brings us to the end of this video. There is quite a bit more that could be said about characters and character development, but there are literally whole books written on it, and this video has gone on long enough anyway. So I'll just leave it at this. Enjoy the process of making characters. It's some of the most fun you're going to have with writing, coming up with unique individuals, finding out what makes one character special, finding out who your characters are. And it's wonderful to see them develop naturally through your story. So just have fun with it. And don't get too worried about it. Don't overanalyze. Don't think too much. I've given you a lot of information here. Don't feel like every single little aspect of the character has to be pre-written. Remember I said leave room for development? Keep that in mind. And enjoy it. And however you decide to write, just write. Thank you all so much for joining me. I'll see you in the next video. Stay safe and keep writing.